Now, how do we start an image if we're not allowed to use any photographs or text or any of that sort of thing? Well, we can generate something to work on. If we go up to Filter, Render, we have Clouds, which will use some frequency patterns to try to generate something cloud-like. Now, it will use your foreground and background color to do this. So if you get something like red and purple, then it will generate red and purple clouds. Window, Filter, Render, Clouds. And now we have these red-purple clouds. Now, keep in mind that these are not identical. Even if we were to desaturate this or do a couple of them, it will be different every single time. Notice the pattern shift. It's generating these, but we don't have control over the generation, which makes sense because if we take a look at the Filter, Render, Clouds, there's no dot icon after anything. If we did something with a dot icon like fibers, we would have control over things by increasing the variance or the strength. And you can see immediately that strength is essentially, actually you can't because it's so small. Let me zoom in. You can see very quickly what these do. Here's 0 strength. There's no push on the fibers. Here's 64 strength, which is as strong as it can get. A definite up and down push. Variance just creates essentially, let me zoom out so you can see variance. And this is just on fibers. Variance essentially creates the, variance in the noise pattern that's being used to create the strands. So if you're really trying to do fibers, you want stuff below usually, I think 30-ish, somewhere in there. Anything above that starts to get a little pixelated. All right, so you could generate things with the fibers, for example, any of those renders. You also have difference clouds. Let's pick a couple of clear colors. We'll do a red and we'll do a green. Move that. All right, so we've got a new layer here. Filter, Render, Difference Clouds. Oh, notice immediately it complains. Why? Well, Difference Clouds is different from clouds. It's essentially doing inverts of what's going on. So let's start with, say, these fibers. Let me duplicate that. So where clouds would generate something, Difference Clouds needs to work off of the previous layer. We'll do Difference Clouds. So where the clouds end up, it's doing a difference. All right, so what do I mean though by it's creating a difference? Well, think of it this way. If we grab another one of these copies of the fiber layer and we just go to Render Clouds, create some standard clouds, and then go to Edit, and then go to Fade, Clouds, and then set it from normal mode to difference mode. Boop, 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 difference. There we have it. And you can fade this backwards and forwards. You can see that that is essentially the same as our difference clouds. So there are a couple of hidden options for clouds in Photoshop. This doesn't matter too much for this class, but if the document you're working in is divisible by 128, then so if it's 128 pixels or what would be 256 pixels or 512 pixels or 1024 pixels and it's a square, the clouds should render out in a repeatable pattern. So if you go to Edit Define Pattern, you can grab a repeating cloud pattern that way. That's a fun little fact. Supposedly, you can hold down the Alt key when you get clouds, render clouds. I missed, and instead I grabbed a tool I did not want. Let's try that one more time. Now, if you're going to be rendering out difference clouds, you can just start with any color you want. All right, now, same with clouds here. Let me set these just to black and white. Filter, Render, Clouds. Holding down the Alt key, and I missed that again. I'll start from the beginning instead of tapping it. Filter, Render, Clouds. Supposedly, it will create denser clouds. Let's see an example. Without the Alt key, Filter, Render, Clouds. And that does seem to be the case. So I suppose it still works. So that's one way to start generating things, just using the Filter, Render options. And there are a few others. If we come in here, we can see that there's Filter, Render, Lens Flare, which if you want to go crazy, you can add a lens flare. Honestly, people tend to use lens flare wrong. The correct way to use lens flare is with an overlay layer. Let me show you what I mean. So let's create a new layer. And we'll do a, whoops, I'm doing an adjustment layer, my bad. Let's go ahead and create a new layer. Ooh. With Control-Shift-N to create a brand new layer that we can set to overlay mode. This is the same thing as layer, new layer. And then fill it with neutral gray, right? So we have a neutral gray layer here set to overlay so we can't see it. If it were on normal, we'd be able to see it. All right. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and go to Filter, Render, Lens Flare. And you usually want to make this small enough that it's not falling off the screen. Tell it OK. And now we can just move this lens flare around wherever we want. And it's independent of everything else, so we can move it onto different layers altogether. And you don't have to worry about it. So yeah, a lot of times people use lens flare wrong. It works best when you've attached it to an overlay layer with a 50% gray fill. That way the lights get lighter, but not so burned out as if it were set to lighten, for example. Yeah, so heads up on that. I think that's pretty useful. So those are several ways of rendering things out. You also have lighting effects, which is an entirely different way of doing a rendering. Let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah, we've got time. Let's go ahead and go to Render. And if you go to Lighting Effects, it will complain, like everything else in Render, it needs to have something to work on. So let me duplicate a layer. You could just fill it with a solid color, but I've got all these layers anyway, so let's start there. Filter, Render, and Lighting Effects. This is a big one. Voila. Now, lighting effects is pretty interesting, and we're going to get into these on-screen adjustment tools. If you see something like this, you'll have usually controls to stretch things out if you grab these little handles, or narrow things down. And you can rotate by clicking on these and spinning them up and down, or on the bar, so if you don't want to resize it by accident. Clicking inside of it will let you move things around. If you have one of these knobs, this is your intensity, you can do it right on the screen. And then if you have one of these, you can increase it within the internal circle. All right, so that's how these controls work. You'll see these from time to time throughout the effects. Now, that said, you can add more lights, and you just do that through the little flyout menu. And I'm sorry, not through the flyout menu. It's up here just under lights now. So if you mouse over, you should see a new spotlight, new point light, and new infinity light. So if we do a point light, you'll see one of these guys, and it is actually trying to represent a point light. And so you don't have a whole lot of options on it. You could, in fact, change the color. You'll start getting some of these horrible browns I'm always warning people not to use. Let's just switch it to maybe a nice red. That's a little better. You can increase the intensity or decrease the intensity, but you also have the metallics, which tries to act as though the material you are lighting is metallic. Ambient light, which is your overall around light. So if you turn that down, you can get back to just a dimmer light. Gloss, what if your material was glossy, slightly reflective? And exposure, what if you overexposed something? Now you've got these options, and you can turn off and on the eyeball to bring them back in and out, and notice how they interact with each other. It's actually trying to model lights. You can also colorize, which could sometimes have an effect you want, but generally it will not have the effect you want due to the intensity of the light that will be changed. You can preview the number of stops, which I think is great. Here are the 32-bit values, which we're not using in this case, so don't worry about that right now. And you can change these to the different hues and saturations. You can also load in different color libraries and all that. And you can undo if you don't like something, just Control-Z. So this is far too intense. I'm going to turn this down quite a bit. All right, so we've got a point light. What if we wanted to convert that to a spotlight? Not a problem. You can do exactly that at any time. And you can put as many of these as your computer can handle. You can also do an infinite light, which will essentially be a super controllable ambient light. But so it has an intensity. It's like the sun, and you can see how it's trying to model it. I don't know why I said ambient. If it's at the noon position, it is like ambient light. But if you rotate this the slightest bit, you're essentially recreating the sun. And this is you can model it exactly like that. Now, keep in mind, this is a flat piece of paper you're rotating into things. You can add textures to these, to the different channels. So here is the green channel with the texture applied to it. Here's the red. Here's the blue. I kind of like that. And let's make that not as glossy, maybe not as metallic. And let's change the color to something less awful. I mean, reds are fine, but they shouldn't be gross. It's really easy to start to look like weird organs and things on that. So once you're happy with it, tell it okay. And voila, you've got a lighting effect. Now, does that work on smart objects? One easy way to tell, convert it to a smart object. Go to Filter, go over to Render, and grab a lighting effect. And sure enough, not only does it work, but that does mean that we can go back and do edits to it later. We can increase the hotspot, which is the range of the brightest area. I think I forgot to mention that. And yeah, there you have it. So this is a great way to also start generating stuff. You can cancel out of this by pressing cancel, or you can press OK to add it in. So there are some ways to generate different textures for a starting point. I should show you how to create the texture channel appropriately while we're in here, though. Let's say that we've got this cool cloud thing. Let's go ahead and copy this, and we will go over to our channels, and we will load in a new alpha channel and paste in Control V. So we've got this guy, right? And now we'll come over to our layers, and we'll come back to, let's do this. Yeah, we'll come back to our smart object. That seems like a safe place to play. And we'll do one more filter, render, lighting effects. Now we should have access not just to the red and green and blue, but also our alpha channel. Here we go, which will allow us to create a bump map type effect. And if I remember correctly, black is considered a valley and white is considered a peak while it's trying to render this light out. So in other words, it will be brighter on the lights and cast shadows cast shadows off of the lighter areas. But the dark areas are harder to light. You have to have very bright things in it. Here we go. And so we've got this kind of structure immediately happening. So we're starting to build something already. If you don't like the color, something you can always do is grab your hue and saturation and just rotate those colors around until you find something more palatable. I think that looks a little bit better already. And voila, you've got something to work with. And that's one way to do that. Let's go ahead and look at another way. See you next video.